Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Katherine Conroy, and I'm a data operations analyst at RDC. I also co-author RDC's Insider Insights, which covers financial crime trends. So we cover anything from human trafficking to hate crimes. But today I want to focus specifically on wildlife trafficking as a financial crime risk. So in the past, wildlife trafficking has mostly been considered an animal rights issue or an environmentalist issue that's of low risk. But as it's been evaluated as a $259 billion industry, it is garnering more attention from financial institutions, and they're allocating more investment toward analyzing these trends. So for a little presentation overview, first I want to talk a little bit about what are RDC Insider Insights for those of you who aren't familiar with them, then go over a little bit of the 2020 initiatives that have highlighted wildlife trafficking. Then we'll look at some of the species that have been in high demand for wildlife traffickers. Then we'll look at the rise in awareness over the past couple of years in wildlife trafficking as a financial crime. And then I'll do a short overview of some supply chains in regards to elephant trafficking and the ivory trade, as well as big cat trafficking. And then we'll look at the overlap with wildlife trafficking and financial crimes. So to build RDC Insider Insights, we combine the data that we have on financial crimes with our visualization software, RDC View, and we combine this with external research to provide financial crime analysis. And to gather our data, we ingest adverse media, sanctions and watch lists, information on politically exposed persons, and special collections lists into our global risk information database, also known as GRID. And because RDC intakes media, we do depend quite a bit on legislation, the enforcement of legislation, and the reporting that goes along with it. So in order to build these insights, we do require that there are initiatives taking place, especially within financial institutions, and some of those initiatives in 2020 have come from the Financial Action Task Force, which has made wildlife trafficking a priority for 2020, as did the 6th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. But more unexpectedly, the coronavirus has highlighted wildlife trafficking, as some of the sources of the virus have been allocated to different endangered species or unregulated trading of certain species. There's been talk about pangolin being related to the virus or bats, and whether or not these species are the source of the virus, we can definitely anticipate that as governments and as institutions lay out prevention plans for future pandemics, they will take into special consideration wildlife trafficking. When we think about what is wildlife trafficking, it covers any unregulated or illegal trade of species, whether that's animal or plant. So here we can see the different seizure rates of different species. Rosewood is the top species, and then as I go through this presentation, I'll focus a little bit more on elephant trade and the ivory trade, a little bit on the reptile trade, the pangolin trade, which as I said was somewhat linked to the coronavirus, as well as big cat trafficking, which has been thrown a little bit into the spotlight this year due to the Tiger King and that sort of pop cultural phenomenon. So that's another way that wild trafficking has become more cognizant in the public eye. Right, so we have seen an awareness of wildlife trafficking as a financial crime rising over the past couple of years. And this is quite visible through our pangolin-related adverse media captures. These have been on the rise since 2015, and we can see there's a particular uptick in 2016, and that's when CITES, or the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, banned all international trade of any pangolin species. From 2018 to 2019, we saw a 54% increase in the pangolin-related adverse media, and the 2020 rate is already projected to surpass that of 2019. So in 2020, we can see that capacity building around wildlife trafficking enforcement has played a big role in how wildlife trafficking is being reported. So for the first time in 2020, Namibia's rate of capture of pangolin adverse media has surpassed that of India. India had the highest rate of pangolin adverse media for the past 5 years up until now. And we can attribute this to a collaboration between the UN and the Africa's Prosecutors Association, which took a specific look at building capacity within the enforcement of wildlife trafficking in various nations in Africa, where wildlife trafficking has severely undermined some of the social development in the past. So you might be wondering, where does wildlife trafficking occur? And the truth is, it's happening everywhere. But what we know about geographic location depends on at what stage of the supply chain someone is prosecuted for wildlife trafficking. So in the case of elephant trafficking, we can see the highest adverse media related captures in India. And since India is a native habitat to elephants, we might expect these people to be poachers or smugglers. But on the contrary, the United States is the third highest capture for adverse media related to elephants. And in that case, we might expect that someone is an importer or an exporter or perhaps a broker. We can see this US consumer demand for wildlife trafficking in big cat trafficking as well. In fact, the US is the #1 for adverse media related captures of big cat trafficking, which surpasses some places such as India, which might be native to large cats. Today, there's more big cats in captivity in the US than there are in the wild. And you can see with that teal color that the UK and Italy are also pretty large consumer markets for big cat trafficking. Now, if you look over to the right, you'll see Doc Antle and Joe Exotic, or the Tiger King, who were featured in National Geographic on their spread about the tiger trade, but you also probably know them more so from the Netflix series Tiger King. So they kind of represent some of the US consumer demand for big cats, whether it's for private petting zoos or for performance purposes. And Joe Exotic himself is a perfect example of where wildlife trafficking overlaps with other financial crimes, as he himself has been convicted on perjury and fraud in addition to wildlife smuggling charges. So when we look at this overlap in wildlife trafficking and the other crimes associated with them, we can see that within pangolin trafficking, reptile trafficking, and elephant trafficking, the highest associated codes are environmental crimes and smuggling. We also see a really high rate of organized crimes. But when we look into them, we also see that with pangolin trafficking, we also have arms trade, and that's the same with elephant trafficking. We also have human trafficking with pangolins, theft, murder, fugitive and drug trafficking, and assault. With reptiles, we also see theft, fraud, murder, assault, and drug possession. And with elephants, we see, again, organized crime, murder, arms trafficking, money laundering charges, drug trafficking, assault, fraud, and counterfeiting. And counterfeiting is an interesting one because that would be in relation to the falsification of documents. So that's probably within the transport of the species. So these are all captures of each of these species being trafficked, and then where these crimes occurred in the same context as that. So that might mean that, say someone was captured for trafficking a pangolin, but maybe they also had heroin on them. So they got a drug possession charge or a drug trafficking charge in addition to the species smuggling charge. So even though wildlife trafficking is the 4th largest criminal area in the world behind drugs, arms, and human trafficking, all of these crimes really work on a continuum. There's an overlap in supply chains, whether that be transportation routes or communication networks or tactics. So we really need to approach all of these crimes on a holistic, risk-based approach. Historically, there has been a low risk and a high reward for traffickers. However, something so interesting to me about the lack of concern in wildlife trafficking is that a lot of times items that might be captured under a wildlife trafficking charge may eventually turn into a product that is considered higher risk. So for example, the trade of poppy seeds might be considered a wildlife trafficking charge, but that's an essential ingredient into the production chain of heroin. So then that falls into a drug trafficking charge. So because of this simultaneous and intertwined market system that's happening, we need to take a high risk-based approach to wildlife trafficking so that we could thwart other organized trafficking organizations and crimes. All right, so in conclusion, wildlife trafficking is a high-risk financial crime, and it does intersect with many other forms of organized trafficking and associated financial networks worldwide. The awareness raised by legislation, enforcement, and increased media coverage does allow for greater potential in wildlife-associated risk screening, which is especially imperative to RDC. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to getting to know the FFE a little bit better, and I hope that you guys will reach out with any questions, and please take a look at our Insider Insights on RDC's website, find out more about wildlife trafficking and our other insight topics. So, thank you very much.